Healthcare consumers, providers, creators, and advocates. Health and wellness should be everyone's top priority, and it's a dynamic topic, complex and sensitive to a vast array of factors from a local to an international scale. The healthcare industry is now at the forefront of everyday life and hopefully on the cusp of a renaissance. We're glad you've joined us for this series that explores the ideas shaping healthcare. I'm Minta Ferguson, healthcare architect and director of the Strategic Facility Planning Group, McMillan Pasden Smith Advisors. And this is Ideas Shaping Healthcare. Carbon neutrality is a global concern, but actually achieving it for hospitals is much more complex and difficult than in your average facility. Today we're joined by Michael Scruggs and Greg Hudson of RMF Engineering. They are both mechanical engineers with experience in the design and analysis of mechanical and plumbing systems serving educational, laboratory, healthcare, and commercial facilities. Greg is also very knowledgeable with the design requirements, standards, and their implementation required for a variety of laboratory and healthcare facilities. So the past few years, there have been quite a lot of discussion and movement towards carbon neutrality, net zero, or climate positive. We hear of companies like Apple committed to their entire business becoming carbon neutral by 2030. The new Oxford American Dictionary defines it as the balance between emitting carbon and absorbing carbon emissions from carbon sinks. For clarity, carbon sinks are any system that absorbs more carbon than they emit, such as forests, soils, and oceans, basically the environment. In December of 2020, the United Nations published an article titled Carbon Neutrality by 2050, the world's most urgent mission. Over 110 countries have committed to this global coalition, with some extending their deadline, but still moving towards it. They outlined what it takes to get there, 3 steps. The first being that global commitment, and ultimately cutting global emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2010. The second is to align global finance with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, the third, to secure a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience to help those facing dire impacts of climate change. I summed some of this up with basic definition, 3 steps to get there. And I have to admit that it's just the tip of the iceberg and it sounds really simple with just those 3 things. But I know it's much more complex than that. So here today we have Greg and Michael, and they're going to kind of break down for us how to think about getting the ball rolling for healthcare facilities and carbon neutrality, because they're really complex and changing environments. And they have a big footprint. So just to kind of get us started, maybe why is it a bigger push now for carbon neutrality for healthcare facilities?
So in general, carbon neutrality has become a really good buzzword, and we hear it a lot more with a lot of entities. We deal with a lot of higher education facilities up north, a lot of Ivy League schools. They sort of have some initiatives, and the push is really coming from their students and their faculty, and they're wanting to sort of see like what is our campus's plan, what is our plan. I think there's been some spillover from that. A lot of it probably with those higher education facilities that have a hospital component. Like I was at ASHE PDC last week, and one of the presentations was about Stanford Children's Hospital. So Stanford obviously is one of these where there's a groundswell there to be carbon neutral, to be more sustainable, and that has kind of spilled over into what they want to do with their hospital system. So there's sort of been a shift there in terms of what expectations are for users and even staff on what do they want and how do they want it. So it's sort of seemed to have really kicked off within the last year or two. It's just really started happening. So I think we're getting that spillover into healthcare facilities now.
Okay. But what makes it harder for healthcare facilities to become carbon neutral? What are the challenges?
In general, healthcare facilities are big energy users to start with anyway. Mm-hmm. So we've got higher change rates for spaces. We have very specific environmental conditions we need for operating rooms and for different kinds of facilities, different kinds of procedures. So that requires a lot of energy use to be able to maintain those. So in general, they're just big energy users. So as part of that, and when we sort of talk about carbon neutrality, we see electrification kind of come in. you end up having to do something. So it's do we switch away from getting away from using fossil fuels to be able to do that, and we switch it over to electric. So there's the electrification piece. So I think them just being big energy users in general means they're big targets for, and big carbon. They're big producers of carbon.
What challenges does the GHG, which is the federal greenhouse gas standard, and so they reference like scope 1, scope 2 emissions. What does the GHG present that are specific to hospitals?
So the thing to understand with scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 is let's kind of break those down a little bit. So scope 1 and scope 2 are really the things that hospitals have a fair amount of control over. Scope 1 is the biggest one. Those are basically all the things that you produce that actually produce carbon on site, on your building site. Scope 2 are kind of ancillary things, and then scope 3 is basically anything that's really not under the hospital's control. So that's like patients coming in, staff traveling in, those kinds of things where not a whole lot of control. Hospitals are hard, again, because they use a lot of energy to start with. A lot of them have steam systems, big steam systems where they're using natural gas boilers, and we have diesel generators, and we have all of that for the resiliency and the reliability of the facility. And at the same time, a lot of people coming in and out of those facilities more so than you would think about for an office building where you can sort of have a little bit more control. They're sort of these open spaces where anybody can come in and out. So how people are coming in and out certainly has big impact on them.
So we were talking about with scope 1, 2, 3, as you work away from scope 1, you're getting more and more difficult to affect change with that scope. But at the same time, what is unique about a hospital is because they a lot of times generate steam on site, and because they have more critical infrastructure than, say, an office building, they have more scope 1 to deal with. So yes, there's a challenge, but there's also more of that challenge is usually something you can get your arms around. Okay. So there's some unique opportunities there that may be more difficult, but they're in your realm.
Okay. So I think like one of those examples would be some of the MEP systems, so mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems. And what are some of the examples of changes to those systems to reduce carbon emissions?
So one of the big ones that we're seeing a lot more is going to heat pump technologies. So whether that be VRF or more refrigerant-based equipment that sort of functions in a heat pump configuration. We're also seeing some things sort of trending towards bigger central plant equipment. We talk about heat pump chillers, steam absorption chillers. There's other equipment like that that's out there that's getting a little bit more buzz now because it can sort of check this carbon neutral box for you, because it's a big change in terms of system. The downside to those is if you are in a rural area or your power is coming from a source that's not green, quote unquote green, you're just adding on top of that. So it's kind of this weird double-edged sword where you need to make sure that whatever you're doing from an MEP systems perspective is efficient if you're not getting your power from a green source. But it means you're going to have to do more. You're going to have to electrify more of your systems than you maybe had previously. Okay. So it's a weird kind of catch-22. So it leads you to sort of wanting to electrify more, but then making sure that you're as efficient as you possibly can be with those systems.
So you said bigger equipment. So I'm kind of curious, though, does that start to increase the size of the central energy plant? When I think of efficiency, sometimes I'm thinking smaller equipment. We're not taking up as much space, but does it have an impact on the footprint?
It's tough to tell because some of the stuff we're talking about, like big central energy plants, big sort of heat pump chillers and things like that, there aren't big ones. There's not 2,000 ton machines. You don't see 10,000 ton plants. So we're sort of on the edge of being able to do some of that right now. So I wouldn't expect the size of a central energy facility to change. I think one of the things that we would sort of focus on would be the optimization piece. There are a lot of other technologies out there now. Optimum Energy is one. There are some other sort of technologies out there that can optimize your plant operation to get you real tight, low kW per ton values so that you're making the most. Your plant is running as efficiently as it possibly can. So you're reducing your electrical impact as much as possible, and you're running your plant as efficiently as you can. And that's something that most owners can implement now without really having to change a whole lot on their plant. So it may just be, if you're looking at diving into one of these, the first thing maybe to just optimize what you have first, and then you can sort of slowly start to tackle maybe some of the bigger pieces.
Gotcha. Thanks, Greg. So are there unique or innovative technologies that can help systems with carbon neutral goals? What are some of the innovative things happening?
Well, we want to ring the heat pump gong again there.
Yeah.
Heat pump it's a technology that we use every day in our systems, but usually not at that same scale, and usually not as the central heating and cooling for the building, especially not in healthcare facilities. So shifting towards that, where your base generation for your heating and cooling is powered by electricity rather than a fossil fuel, is the only way to really get to a point where you can be carbon neutral.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a big shift. It's like two different ways of setting up the entire system, not just plug and play a few pieces. So yeah, it's a pretty big task.
All right. Thanks, Michael. So let's pretend for a minute that I'm a hospital executive. So I'm a CEO, maybe I have an MBA or an MHA. And so I don't really speak the engineering speak. I maybe don't really know that much about carbon neutrality, but I know it's coming, and I know that it's becoming a trend for healthcare facilities. Where do I start? I mean, I kind of pretend I'm mind boggled. Like, what do I do? I'm overwhelmed.
The first thing to do would be to get an analysis of what your carbon footprint is right now. And there are companies out there that will do that for you. We've actually got a partnership with a company that spawned out of a research project at Clemson University, that they will do carbon footprint analysis for a campus. They recently just completed one for MEIC. So the first step would be to figure out where you are, and let's see where your carbon footprint is. Where is your carbon production coming from?
What does that process include? What does that kind of study look like? Time frame, scale?
Yeah, it's a couple month process for them to go through an entire campus and sort of figure out, and they look at everything. They did this for their own campus as well, and they're not just looking at your central energy facilities. They are looking at trash. They are looking at your trees on your campus. They are looking at how students are coming in and out.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that sort of gets lumped together, and you can sort of get this big holistic picture of this is how your campus functions and what your carbon footprint actually looks like. So it's a really big picture approach to looking at your carbon footprint. And one of the things you may want to think about too is whether you want to tackle scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 together, or you really want to focus on scope 1, scope 2. If you want to do all three, you can get that in that carbon analysis. And I think it would probably be smart to have all of that scope wrapped in. You just may have to make the decision about, do you really want to try and handle how people are getting to your facility as part of your carbon footprint? Or do you want to kind of leave that one off and let's focus on scope 1 and scope 2 where you have a little bit more control?
Gotcha. So then what's the next step after I know my baseline?
Then you sort of have to think about, what do you want your goals to be?
Okay.
And this gets to be an interesting conversation, especially kind of in the market where we're in, where the sustainability and carbon neutrality piece maybe hasn't caught on quite as hard. So then the thing is to think about, do you want your facility to be more sustainable, more resilient, and more efficient, which in turn would save you dollars?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you really want to sort of take the sustainability green bug and sort of take off with that? So you sort of have to figure out what your goals are. And then you'd sort of jump into probably what would be like a master planning type exercise, where you would work with your engineering consultants, your architectural consultants, landscape architects, whoever else that may be on your campus, vendors, people that you have agreements with, like your food service people, like an Aramark. Work with all of those groups to figure out, how do we start tackling these pieces of our carbon footprint? And you may want to look at that in some different ways. One of the ways that we've seen is ranking a bunch of ideas based on how much carbon are you going to reduce per dollar spent. So then do you focus on, let's get the most bang for my buck, or do you pick some things that are really easy? One of the real easy ones is Do you maybe just need to train some staff a little bit differently so that they're operating in a facility in a more sustainable sort of carbon neutral way? There may be some things like that you can sort of do that are easy, really inexpensive, will help, but they may not have the big sticker value that some of these other big projects would have.
Okay, so if I want to do this, let's say carbon neutral master plan, who do I want from my team to be on that project to help with making decisions and moving forward?
We were talking about that on the way up here today because it can't just be your C-suite,
Okay.
but it needs to be people that work well with the C-suite and have their backing. Because the only way to, this is a years long process from start to finish, more than likely, and those people need to support the intermediate steps. But you would want obviously somebody from your facilities department. You would want maybe some clinical involvement, but the goal really is that on the clinical side or the patient care side, they're not going to notice any big difference. But having them, you always want them involved earlier rather than later.
Yeah.
And then really it's your the folks that are in charge of maintaining your equipment and facilitating the different projects that would need to happen next.
So some project managers, facility engineers, maintenance guys,
Right.
those kind of frontline people who'd be responsible for it as it's executed, right?
Yeah, and you need kind of an internal champion for whoever is sort of going to be the spearhead. And you need that person because, like Michael said, you need somebody that can work well with all of those groups. That's a good go-between who can. You can get the backing, you can affect the change sort of at the top end with your hospital leadership group, but also has a good working relationship. So you can work with the facilities folks, you can work with your janitorial staff, you can work with the physicians and everybody else that's within the facility. You need somebody that can sort of go between all of those bubbles together.
So how long does it take to kind of create that master plan, right? So I got the baseline assessment and then I want to create my goals and create that master plan for carbon neutrality. How long does that process take?
It's probably not any different from any other big master planning exercise. It could be a year to 18 months worth of time. If, again, depending on the size of your campus, it could be a lot more to be able to do that because you've got to have a lot of interactions with all the stakeholders. You need to sort of go through that goal creation process and make sure that we're all in alignment as we go. And then you start trying to figure out what are those projects that we're going to be, how are we going to rank them, how are we going to decide what we do and what we don't do. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth that's got to happen between not just with your consultants, whoever's coming in to advise you, but also internally, you guys are going to have to figure out what are we going to do and what are we not going to do? What do we feel like we can change and maybe what can't we in terms of trying to make all of that work together? Because it really has to be a big picture change.
Okay. So what does implementation looks like? I've got the master plan, so I probably have a set of projects that I need to take on. And I would imagine there's like some kind of sequence to them, right? I can't do it all on time. I don't have all the money in the world. So what does that look like?
I think that's really where, as a facilities owner, you sort of have to figure out what you want to do and what you don't want to do. And that's where I think having some kind of metric to rank them is your best bet. Whether you want to do them based on cost, do you want to do them based on time frame? What can you get done quickly versus what you maybe would have to either get capital funding for, or you may have to go out and get money, you may have to raise money, or maybe you want to look for, a big bang kind of project where it does get you a big reduction in your carbon footprint. It's a big, metric ton of carbon per dollar reducer. Or maybe you string together a bunch of projects that are really cheap and easy because that gets you an easy win and you can then sort of build momentum. So I think you sort of have to look at your goals and whatever structure you're going to rank those projects in, it needs to kind of align with what your goals are. If you want to get carbon neutral quick, you're going to have to spend some money up front. If you understand that it's going to be a longer process for yourself, you may want to start out small, get some of those wins, get those people on board, get everybody to buy in, and then it's a little bit easier sell to go do that big capital project to replace a bunch of plant equipment or something like that.
Mhm. So, I mentioned Apple said, oh, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, which at this point, that's less than 10 years away. And in the idea of construction and facilities projects and capital and funding, those, a decade can actually go by pretty quickly. So what is an average time frame for that you can expect to find this carbon neutrality for a hospital?
It's going to be a decade plus, is my
Okay.
guess. And it's probably going to depend on a couple other factors. One of the things we talked about is just age of facility. It may be that you've got a brand new plant and you don't really want to invest in replacing a whole bunch of equipment right now.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean you can't be thinking about what you're going to replace it with and what your plan is going to be as it ages out and it's time to turn it over.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's reasonable for a hospital facility. Everybody likes to be carbon neutral by 2030. We've got clients they've talked about that. That's one of their goals. It's a great goal to shoot for. I think if you're any kind of entity, you sort of need to be realistic with what your expectations are going to be. And for some, it may not be carbon neutral. That may not be possible for everybody. We talked about if you're not connected to any kind of green power source, it's tough to really leverage yourself to be carbon neutral. You can sort of eliminate all the emissions you're creating on site, but you're still maybe connected to a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas turbine. If you're a rural hospital in South Carolina, you may not have a choice. You may just have to live with that. So that's difficult. So again, I think you sort of need to think about that as you start to realize what your goals are going to be and make sure that you're being realistic with what you can actually accomplish.
Okay.
So the common denominator for any of these facilities is going to be optimizing and making as energy efficient as possible what you already have, what you already use, what you already own. So that should really, a lot of times that's some of the low hanging fruit, where with some controls tweaks and uh, using the equipment that you already have, just allowing it to use less energy because of some different things that you do, everybody can do that. And that's really necessary for the next step of starting to change out major equipment, but that's going to depend on the facility. So like Greg was saying, if everything that they just bought is 5 years old, that's going to be hard to sell.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in a rural hospital that's been starved for capital dollars, that just got bought up by a bigger entity, and everything they have is 30 years old, that may be the first project.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start from there. So that's going to depend on what's right for them at that time at that facility. But the energy efficiency piece is a blanket. Anybody can do that. And ultimately, if you start there, if we take that first example, everything's brand new. We don't need to replace major equipment. If you work really hard at making your facility more energy efficient, by the time you do need to replace it, you're replacing it with smaller equipment because you've taken the top off of whatever your requirements are. So it's always a worthy goal.
So that's really interesting. So I have a lot of experience doing strategic facility master plans. And those include facility condition assessments, which to some extent is that baseline assessment, right? But it's not focused on how the facility is supporting carbon emissions or not. But it does have that facility component. And so they're looking at, how do you plan capital for maintenance items on the facility over the next 5 to 10 years? But it's also coordinated with the strategic initiatives of the facility. So, how do we want to grow our services? What major capital projects do we want to do? Like, do we need a vertical expansion project or a new building? Or maybe we want to add an MOB to the campus. And so that's thinking about like the long-term investments that we're making into not just the mechanical and electrical and plumbing equipment, but it's bigger, right? It's the longevity and the viability of the business. And so as part of those master plans, I'm thinking like you have to weave in these carbon neutrality goal discussions, because I could be, especially maybe even a rural hospital that, my facility is maybe it's 50 or 60 years old and it doesn't meet all the code requirements. And I'm starved for capital for infrastructure items. And so really when I start to tally everything up, maybe at that point, if I'm adding the carbon emissions goals to it, maybe the arrow really points me in the direction of like a replacement facility. Or if you are planning to replace your facility as part of your master plan over, say, the next, 10 years, because that's usually the time frame for these. Somehow I got to weave in how I'm going to do the carbon neutrality, whether I'm going to do some of that low hanging fruit you talked about to my existing equipment, just get the ball rolling where I am, but also like how do you plan for it for a new facility?
So there's some resources out there. The greenhouse emissions guidelines that the federal government's provided is a really great tool to sort of help you identify. I think being able to do some kind of carbon assessment on sort of maybe how you function now is still good. But then there are also things like there's a lead for hospitals. There's a green globes
Hmm.
for hospitals. Those are
Hmm.
some really great guidelines that you can sort of look at as a framework where if you're going to build a new facility, hey, we sort of maybe want to build around this. And it
Okay.
doesn't mean you have to go out and get, the big green globes facility. You don't have to do the certification. You don't have to go through the process of applying for LEED Platinum for a hospital. Maybe you don't do that, but maybe you use those as a guide to sort of say, we want to be able to do these things out of this guide that make sense for us as a facility or that sort of align again with your strategic goals long term. So there's some things out there that you could sort of use, and maybe that helps you create your own standards, because a lot of times with some of these master planning exercises we end up with some campus standards, or we get some kind of standard design guide that we're going to use.
Hmm.
It'd be great to take those and again start to weave in how your sustainability goals or your carbon neutrality goals are going to work long term, and go ahead and get that in with your standards. So that way anybody coming into your facility should be designing to those. That should be part of the construction, part of the design, what have you. And that's already built in. And so you've sort of set yourself up there so that no matter who you bring in, whether you change consultants out for
Hmm.
projects or you're an atrium or an HCA and you have hospitals across the country, my design standards are still the same. Everybody's designing
Hmm.
the same thing.
Okay. So as you guys are both talking and we're going through the time frame of this process, we've got the initial baseline assessment. So what are you doing now? And that could be a year or more. And then there's that second phase, which is creation of the master plan and the goals of what we're going to do or try to do. And that could be a year or two. And then the implementation of it, we said, is a decade plus. So we're looking at about 15 years, give or take, depending on the facility and what their goals are. And compare that to the average tenure of, say, a C suite executive at the hospital, which can be around 3 years or so. And depending on the structure, sometimes they're there longer, sometimes they're not. And to that point, facilities folks change out too, right? So there's turnover. So if I'm a hospital executive and I want to create this program and these goals, the lifespan of this project could in essence be longer than my lifespan at that facility. So and you mentioned having a champion for the project. Is it worth creating almost like a succession plan for this type of work? Because this is a really long-term initiative.
Yeah, it's the opposite of a pet project, right?
Yeah.
It's really, it can't be a personal goal for any executive. It has to be an
Hmm.
institutional goal. And it's interesting that you pulled out those two groups
Hmm.
of like a maintenance personnel versus someone in the C-suite. I think those two folks would probably talk about these goals very differently.
Hmm.
Um, and I think the surprising thing that we see at different facilities is a lot of times it may be the maintenance folks that are clamoring for this more than the C-suite, because they see the added benefit and the immediate benefit of the energy efficiency on their operating costs.
Hmm.
So the way I think about it is it's kind of like a square and a rectangle. Like every carbon neutrality project has energy efficiency baked in, but every energy efficiency project isn't necessarily about going carbon neutral. So there is this wonderful overlap there where the maintenance folks are going to be glad that they're saving money. And if everybody's goals have a common denominator, everybody's
Hmm.
moving in the same direction, but they may not all be thinking about it the same way.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that, Michael. Thanks.
It certainly needs to be a cultural change. and you sort of have to get every department, everybody on board. So as you do get that turnover, the goals don't change. It's still a direction and a goal of the organization itself, even though the parts or pieces may get changed out. So that's why, again, that initial champion is great. And if you can get buy-in from all the departments as part of that, makes it a little bit easier, because if one person just leaves one department, there's still all these other ones that still have that in the back of their mind. And so when that new person comes in and they maybe are proposing something that doesn't align, you've still got all these other people saying, wait, this, we're supposed to be doing this. We're supposed to be trending towards carbon neutral.
It's like a charter would be good. Like when you're hired, if you create it as an organizational goal, you create a charter, and then as people move on and new people are hired, there's the charter and people are signing on to it. Like, this is a part of our mission.
I think that's one of the reasons why folks like us are involved in these teams, where yes, the facility folks may turn over, but if you have an established architectural partner or engineering partner that you've worked with on that campus for 2 decades, they're not necessarily going anywhere. So there's an opportunity for us to be helpful as far as steadying the ship, and also identifying goals, and throw our expertise behind all of these pieces in the process. But that's one unique piece where that institutional knowledge doesn't always live 100% with the folks that are boots on the ground. It's the whole group.
So that kind of brings me to my next question. So how, I'm an architect, y'all are engineers. How do we work together to help our owners achieve the goals? Like, what can we do as a team?
I think we have to be proponents of whatever it is that they're asking us to do. If you're going to go and you're going to get a carbon footprint analysis done and you're going to set goals for yourself, then it's our duty to help you achieve those goals, whatever they may be, and make sure that we bring on the expertise and the energy to help you do that. So if that means we've got to get folks that are energy modeling experts, we've got to get folks that are LEED Green Globe experts, if we've got to get folks that specialize in carbon neutrality. There are now some architecture firms I've seen that sort of have sustainability divisions. Internally at RMF, we have a sustainability group that's part of their focus. So we need to be able to bring all of those experts and all of that to bear on any project to make sure that we are helping them achieve their goals. At the end of the day, it's not my facility. It's not my plan. Right. It's not my goal. Yeah. We're there to help facilitate their goals. So I think both of us feel like that's our place in this process, and that's where we need architects that will do the same kind of thing. We need other engineering disciplines and vendors and everybody else to bring that same kind of expertise to the table, so that we can help our owners achieve their goals. That's what our job is.
So that's Greg's take. So Michael, what is your take on how we work together?
Well, I think being the expert in the room is key, but maybe as much so is sort of being that translator. So there, more often than not, you're in that room because the executives or the leaders have a goal and they do not understand how to accomplish that goal. That's why that's the need that we want to fill, is translate a shiny objective into a list of tasks.
Some tactics. Yeah. It makes me wonder, like, how long it'll be before every hospital has, I don't know, like a chief sustainability officer. Like, I think that could be a real thing.
Yeah. I know that
consistent.
At Stanford Children's Hospital, they have a sustainability program. There's somebody that is sort of fills that chief sustainability officer role. So it wouldn't surprise me if that is something that we end up seeing a lot more organizations have. And I think, like we're seeing on the design side, we're going to have divisions that are dedicated to sustainability and carbon neutrality and everything like that. I think that's coming.
Okay.
The places where it's going to work the best are either going to be where the energy manager and the sustainability officer are best buds, or even if they're the same person. If those two people don't get along, it's really hard for any of this to move forward efficiently.
Everyone has to be aligned.
Right.
Yeah. Work towards the same goals. Okay. Well, I want to end with kind of a random funny question because we have to have some humor. But so when we were setting up this podcast, this is the first time we've had engineers on the podcast, and I'm sure you all are very aware of the stereotype of engineers. We're like, oh, we're gonna have some engineers. I'm like, you're gonna have engineers on a podcast, really? And so we were kind of pondering, like, well, engineers really aren't like, how they used to appear, that stereotype.
We're not Dilbert anymore.
And you don't have like the little pocket protectors and that image was like, the engineer's at his desk and he's got the book, like shelves and shelves of books. And I still know engineers who have those, but they're older. And now like there's so much technology and engineering is becoming cool, and there's computer science and there's all these things, solutions to help you come up with really creative solutions. So I'm kind of wondering, like, what's your take on the stereotype now? Is it completely untrue? Do you think just engineering is changing and what we're doing?
Yeah, it's fun. So one of the things I get to do is I get to go meet with prospective engineers as co-op students at Clemson University. So it's really great to see that. I think we're breaking out of that stereotype, especially because there is so much more that's computer based, and at least in the business that we're in, we sort of have to have a little bit of a mentality to be able to talk to people and deal with people. We cannot be sit at desk, do work, leave me alone kind of people anymore. That just doesn't work. And I think the other thing that's really great is it's an ability for us to be able to share our knowledge with other people. I think that's one of the great things that I enjoy, is being able to sort of share that knowledge and help people do some things that maybe wouldn't be able to do on their own. I was given a speech the other night and talked a little bit about, I may not cure cancer, I may not find the next big thing, but if I designed the building where the guy found that, or found that cure, whatever it is, I'm good.
Yeah, you're contributing to it. You're a part of the story.
So it's just different. I do think it's becoming more of the forefront, especially as technology is more present in our day-to-day lives than it was 10 or 15 years ago. But I think we're getting away from that. So we're trying.
Definitely. Yeah.
We all have a little bit of it in us, though. That's true.
That is true. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Greg and Michael. You guys have both been great, and thanks for humoring me on that last question. So I really had to dig a little bit because I'm an architect, but I'm a data person. I like numbers. So when I see a building, I see numbers. I don't really think about like finishes and colors and things like that. So thank you both. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
This is the Pulse Check, where I cover the podcast's key takeaways. The first is this is a long-term commitment, and it takes quite a bit of planning. It's more organization and definitely significantly more structure to keep this a living project. You have to have the right people around the table through the entire process and aligning everyone against common goals. The second is pushing carbon neutrality is always energy efficient. You just need to prioritize what you want to do, whether it's low-hanging fruit and things you can do easy now, the big bang for the buck, or is it a long-term big investment that needs to come later? And then finally, we have to lean on experts to guide and translate and define realistic goals. We have to weave it into a strategic facility plan so we know what we're going to do as we stay in existing facilities and maintain them, or if we're going to start replacing facilities or do entire replacements.